Hello and welcome to the ApiOpenStudio Introduction Seminar. My name is John and I'm the developer and founder of ApiOpenStudio. Today's seminar will be a short introduction to ApiOpenStudio and a demonstration of its features. I'm going to walk you through the broad features of ApiOpenStudio and API development and demonstrate the process of creating a quick resource and documentation. ApiOpenStudio is the new open source framework that will allow you to create and fully manage REST API resources for your applications and clients. First of all, let's look at the modern trends in API and API first methodology, and then we'll break this down. This will help you to understand the ApiOpenStudio design pattern and how this will fit into your everyday development and shorten development and maintenance times, and therefore costs. Go. Firstly, APIs are designed to importantly decouple programmatic logic from data. This extends the data layer in the traditional n-tier web architecture, providing a decoupled and uniform interface to the data. However, processing is often required on the data to calculate the response. For example, integrating multiple data streams into a single result. This is where ApiOpenStudio is in its element, because it adds a processing logic tier to the data layer. In other words, you can add processing and calculations before presenting the data through an API. Secondly, APIs should be consistent in their design. This includes consistency in their URL, input variable names, output formats, data structures, etc. It makes it easier for the API developers, testers and users to integrate the APIs into their code. This is called developer UX or DevX, and it's becoming an increasingly important factor as the industry is becoming more and more focused on making developers' lives easier. This leads to easier task completion, happier developers, and increased developer output. ApiOpenStudio is designed to be a language agnostic with its low-code approach, whilst incorporating programmatic logic. This makes it easier and quicker for developers to use, freeing them up for more important and complicated tasks, such as consuming the APIs. Thirdly, security for API resources is a major consideration. Nearly all resources require some form of security layer to prevent unauthorized access to data. From a business level, this is really important. The essential answer is defining who is allowed to access what. This can be forms of a single user to single or multiple resources, groups of users, again to single or multiple resources like a department, team, group of applications or companies. You've got multiple groups to a single or multiple resources, and also subsets of groups to a single or multiple resources. We can go into this further if you wish, but basically ApiOpenStudio allows you to assign these permissions to users for all of those above use cases. The groups can be users that belong to an account, application, or some other custom group that could go across multiple applications. Fourthly, APIs must be versionable. This allows you to cater for new versions of an API resource without having to immediately deprecate an older version, causing a cascade of operational issues. The standards for this is to define a version in the URL, usually at the beginning in the form of v1, v2, etc. ApiOpenStudio allows for this. Fifthly, APIs enable a risk-on microservice approach rather than a risk-off approach of traditional monolithic code bases. What this means is that in the traditional style of monolithic code bases, any change to the codes, bug fixes or features meant that it always carried risk This is called risk off, so it meant that there were less frequent releases because of the extended time for testing, because of the interconnectedness of everything, compared to the microservice approach, which is much lighter because they're smaller snippets of code. You can make one change here very quickly, and if there's the problem, the rollback is much quicker. So this is why it's called risk on. Now, it's very possible that your organization will have a lot of API resources. These need to be in their own reasonable system or systems, which is preferable obviously to one single system to enable an easy deployment of fixes. This enables more agility and more updating of single or multiple resources at once, rather than having a single monolithic API system requiring a full deploy of all resources whenever you change a single resource. ApiOpenStudio allows CRUD applications of individual resources, which are then stored in the database, thus removing the issue of potentially monolithic code bases and versioning. In fact, you can export the resource definitions, and these can be stored in a separate repository for versioning purposes. And finally, sixthly, documentation. Documentation. This is part of DevX that we discussed earlier. All resources should be fully documented, preferably in a popular format like OpenAPI or Redoc, but it can be whatever your organization prefers. This ensures easy consumption of the APIs, faster dev time. Chances of ghost or duplicate resources are dramatically reduced. Makes project management much easier. And guess what? ApiOpenStudio fully supports documentation in OpenAPI. You can upload documentation, and if the resources don't exist, it will automatically generate stubs for them. If you generate new resources themselves without any documentation there, it will add documentation onto the system for it. This brings us on to a fundamental part of API development, API first methodology, and the design and development process. This is a huge topic in itself, so I won't go into a lot of detail here, but studies demonstrate that a major portion of time is saved by first designing and documenting the APIs before doing any development. The documentation itself within API or Redoc creates models of the resources with stub data that an application can call. This means that if you're developing an application, that can be done at the same time as the API design and development. So ideally, once the API is designed, you'll be able to upload the documentation to ApiOpenStudio, which would then generate stubs for you. And your developers can then work into them, updating the documentation and fleshing out the processes that the resources need to run exactly at the same time as your developers who are working on applications that are consuming the APIs are working on their code. Now, not all projects and organizations have the size, time, or existing processes to cater for this API first methodology. So, although ApiOpenStudio advocates the API first methodology, it's not opinionated. You can ask ApiOpenStudio to generate documentation for the resources you've already done. So you can, if you want to, although I wouldn't recommend it, you could develop the resources first, then publish the documentation afterwards. So with all this automation for the documentation, I'm sure you're wondering, what about security with the documentation? You don't want documentation for resources available to users who shouldn't be able to see that resource. So we've set it up so that documentation is visible on the admin side to all registered users, even ones with a consumer role. However, the documentation, whenever they view it, is dynamically generated, so they can only see the documentation for resources that they have access to, whether it's as a developer, a consumer, or an account manager. So, let's do a quick walkthrough of the basic processes for creating an API. I'm not going to upload pre-existing documentation, as I would recommend. I'm going to be a bad lad. I'm going to create a resource and its associated entities, and then we'll take a look at the documentation. So I've got a fresh setup in my developer environment. So this is now running at the moment, and I've opened up the admin. Let's log in. Nope. Now this is completely bare. You should see that the only account is the core ApiOpenStudio and should be the core application. Yep. And no users other than myself, which is admin. So we're going to spin up a new account and there we go, we'll add the account and we'll call this one Seminar. Thank you. We'll add an application and we'll associate this with Seminar and we'll call it Introduction. All done. Right, now we'll add 2 new users just for the testing. So we'll add, whoops. Oh no, that was right, sorry. Plus, I thought I was on view there, so active, so we'll add a new one and we'll call this one Developer. Email is going to be dev@foobar.com and give it a password. That's just the base that we need there. Create. And we'll add another user and we'll call this one Consumer. That's all done. Now we'll add 2 new user roles. We will assign the consumer with consumer to introduction. And we'll add another one for developer. We'll give him developer access to introduction. That's also up there. Now, I'm going to log out and come in as developer. And I should now have visibility to only one account, Seminar. Same with application, should be introduction. Done. Right, so now as a developer I can add a resource. Yes, I know that. So I will create a new resource and of course that warning will disappear. Let's just do a hello world. For visibility, and this will belong to Seminar and introduction. It'll be a get, and the URL will just be hello/world. We'll give it no TTL. We're not going to give it any security. What I'm going to do is just add a basic string. which will be a primitive. So we'll need a string and blind. Machine name is varString. So the process is going to be ID, just the ID for the processor, and we'll give it the processor of varString, and then that takes one value here that you can see called value. There's not going to be any fragments. The output is going to be just in the response. So with that, you will be able to see this in JSON as well. And we'll upload that. Done. Now, if I then go to OpenAPI, I should be able to see the new API. And there it is. Automatically generated, so there's nothing in there for inputs because there's no parameters. But you can see we've got the generic error, unauthorized, and that would actually not come up because there is no security, but I can go in to edit it. So I can show you this. And there, if I take this into introduction, and we'll have to convert to YAML. There we go. So what I can do as a developer, I can go in and I can edit this and it will update the documentation. Now we can also then go in to do a test. I'm going to test this with Postman. And the URL is going to be I'm just going to take it from here. It's going to be, that's going to be right, it's going to be seminar/introduction. So this is how the URIs are formed, and then we've got hello world. Now we don't have any authorization required because we didn't put any security, so this should be open to absolutely everybody. If I send, there it is. And as an extra test, I'm going to just change the header. I'm going to change accept to application XML. There it is. And that should now send that response there that's in JSON as XML. Wallop. There we go. Beautiful. So that's working nicely. Let's add some security into this one now. So let's go back into the resources as developer and we'll edit this. And we'll add some security onto this. We will add validate token roles. So this means we can say must have a token and must have a role. So there you can see we've got, excuse the dog in the background there. Quiet dog. And we'll The only person that can use this will be consumer. Validate account true is going to be default, so we'll leave that as a default on. Same with the application. So that basically means on the URL part. And we'll upload that. Now, if I go in again, I should see this fail. Ooh. I don't think that's correct. Just double check what I've got going on in here. I've got a 500, so I think the error is going to be in here. That's why. So there was no. That's kind of expected because there was no token in there. Now what I will do now is log in as developer. And my very secure password of pass. Don't do this, please. It's just my local, so I don't care. Now I'm going to steal this token and put this into here. Let's add this and should still fail. Permission denied because I was in as developer. However, if I now change this one to consumer, so I'll log in and get a consumer token using the standard login flow, and we'll take that token and log in, and this should work. And drum roll, wallop. Okay, so that's it for the basics that we've got going on here. Basically, we have an account. The application belongs to the account. We've got two users. The users are associated with different roles to the application. And then we have the resource that we created here associated with the account and application. And we're able to see the documentation and edit the documentation if we wanted, and this was all automatic generated. So to conclude, just for this introduction, you can see ApiOpenStudio fully embraces API first methodology. It's not opinionated and allows for all organization processes and client structures. Basically, what you saw there was me doing it the wrong way around. However, we still got full documentation pumped out there that I can then edit and publish as I wish. It allows for fast and agile development, and it's not monolithic in structure. You saw me jumping into an existing resource, making a quick change to add the security, and there it was. It's instantly applied. It allows for versioning in the URI structure, so that will be in the custom part that I put in there, which was the seminar/introduction. Probably what I should have done for this demo would have added a V1 into there, so that I can then, when I come up with a new version, add a new resource as a clone of the old one and call it V2/seminar/introduction, and then up to V3, V4, what have you, and you can deprecate as you wish. It's got high extendability so it's not your average low-code product. it's designed for developers as well as citizen developers. So you can take this as deep as you want. You can create your own processes, and this is very, very simple. Even within the admin GUI, you can add and remove Composer dependencies. So it will set up Composer yourself if you want to add your own GitHub repository of a custom processor. You can put it in there. You can download and install third-party or community plugins. It's all there, and it can compartmentalizes resources into account, application, and role for security purposes. So this makes it highly extendable. You can use any format of group of users, accounts and applications and roles to get and give them access to specific resources. From a business perspective, ApiOpenStudio is fully open source and free to use, and it always will be. This is guaranteed. The source code is fully available on GitHub, GitLab, and Composer, and that's for setups that have their own Apache and Nginx servers. If you don't have an Nginx or Apache server, all you need to do is spin up an Ubuntu server in AWS, and we have images on Docker Hub, so you can self-host. You just download the image, spin up the container, and it's going. For developer and API management times are dramatically reduced, and the setup of accounts with applications resources are designed to tightly couple with any possible organization, clients, and projects. Thank you, and now I'm going to open up the floor to questions and answers. Thank you very much for listening. Right, so we're now into the question and answer phase. I'm actually not seeing any questions coming yet. However, there was something that I didn't mention in the seminar that I wanted to address, which is about the open source nature of ApiOpenStudio. Oh, thank you, F for Australia. That's exactly what I was going to talk about. How do we know it will remain open source? There's a few things that come into play here. The first one actually is more ethical and moral. There was something my father said to me. It's one of those life lessons you have as a young man. The background to what he said don't matter, but there was one thing that he said to me that has always stuck with me. You're not a young man, you're not a young child in the playground anymore, you're a big boy. Words are really important. You have to stand by everything that you say. And that has stuck with me throughout my life. If you say something, you have to stand by what you say. So if we say ApiOpenStudio is going to remain open source, it will, absolutely, guaranteed. There's another factor to that, and this is not a humble brag, I'm a developer. At nature, I'm a developer, and there's nothing more annoying, and I'm sure you all feel the same, even as businessmen, than when products come out and businesses, the organization, are utilizing the open source nature of a product to get the ground base up, and then they renege on that, and they start withdrawing all the functionality and moving that all to the enterprise tier, and those that have adopted the open source are left there out in the cold. That is, in my opinion, that is absolutely appalling behavior. So we will not renege on our commitments to the open source community. If we say we are open source, we will remain open source forever. In fact, it's a core part of our business, of the business plan that we have. Having made the decision to go open source, It's now become a core component in what we have, and this is something else that can help guarantee this for you, because we will have two streams, the open source and the enterprise stream. The open source stream will feed the enterprise stream. As more and more users come into it, hopefully they will migrate to the enterprise stream as they get bigger and bigger clients, etc. It's therefore in our own interest to ensure that the open source and the open source product remains that way and remains as open and as easy as possible to use. In fact, similar to Fedora and Ubuntu, the extensions, the plugins, the processes, the resources that are tested in the open source will then, once they're proved to be solid enough, will be migrated into core as well for the enterprise community to then use as well. So it all feeds into its own ecosystem. So we will not be getting rid of the open source one iota. There was actually something else I was going to say on that, and I've forgotten what it was now. Never mind. Okay, are there any more questions? Let's talk about, from the business point of view, then, how ApiOpenStudio can help you. Here we go. Sorry, I'll come back to that. I suppose I want to know. Yes, how will ApiOpenStudio cope with adopting to requirements that are already set up for? So, yes, this is a young product. However, I've built it in a modular way. So it's split into, from a technology point of view, two things: resources and processes. Processes are the logical part that you saw there, which is the var string, and there's many others, including the security parts. They're all individual bits of code processes, the semantic blocks encoding. And then a resource, which is that Hello World API resource that you saw that utilizes the processor components. So I built it in a way that the processors can be added individually. You can create your own personal ones if you want in your own repository and store it in GitLab or GitHub or your own personal repo. And you can then migrate it into the code base where it's got install, uninstall, update functions, so you can do updates to the database if you need extra tables that you need to install. That can be controlled by the contributors on the processors, and your own resources can then use those processors as you bring them in. There are other plugins as well for things like the output. The output that you saw in that hello world was just in the response. I've actually built multiple components that can go to Azure, AWS bucket, email, SSH, FTP, FTPS, a whole load of others, and there will be more coming. So that kind of shows how it's very pluggable. And we will be creating a library that will, similar to Theme Forest, but free, and will allow users to log in and download contributions to the community. So that's how we'll work with that one. If you need to produce your own, you can, or you can install third-party plugins. That's basically it. Yeah. I forgot what my last statement was going to be, and I got so carried away with that statement. Sorry, guys and ladies. Sorry. Okay, let's give it a couple more minutes, see if there's any more questions. If not, I'm going to think of a final wrap-up statement, and we'll call it a day. Okay, I've remembered what my statement was, so just while we wait to see if anybody else has any more questions, I was going to approach ApiOpenStudio from the business point of view, from the digital agencies. How can ApiOpenStudio help me as a digital agency produce things quicker and faster? And there we go, that's exactly the same question I was going to go at compared to ProCode. Well, sort of anyway, but I will cover that as soon as I can. Come to that for Australia. So you've already seen how quickly it can be. You can produce an API. In fact, it was a very, very simple way of producing the hello world. There are many other ways you can do, like install. You can take get variables, post variables. You can fetch variables from the system. You can store them in temporary variables, permanent variables, external API calls, which is actually, in my view, is going to be the main usage, which is where you want to produce business logic on multiple inputs from APIs into a sanitized result, which is essentially the business logic, and produce that for applications or web applications. I did mention in the seminar about the risk on, risk off approach of this with the code base. So you're going to find it much, much easier to have a single place where it's all stored. You can then export it, and if you want to store them in text form, JSON or YAML, you can put those into a separate repository, which is then saved should you happen to lose the database or not do any backups. It means that, and if you do that, it also then means that rolling back becomes much, much quicker. Because it's modular, you have the reuse of individual components of the processes within future resources. So if you spend a few days producing an individual process, that can then be reused in all your future products that you've got running. So compared to a ProCode system, now this is a hard one to estimate on how much time saving can I get with ApiOpenStudio versus a ProCode system. The best I can do is a finger in the air estimate, which would probably be under 50% faster, which is still a heck of a saving. If you've got the setup for ApiOpenStudio, we've now got the Dockers down in hub.docker for production. This would mean that you can actually have this set up within a matter of an hour or a couple of hours. And that's fully functioning with the production database, HTTPS, SSL certificates, and admin setup. So you've got that one set up already. You don't have to do the massive setup for Codebase that you would have if you had to use, say, okay, brain block while I'm on the spot, but I can't think of it. Say Laravel, super product, but setting up Laravel and then coding your individual API resources is not going to be as fast, nowhere near as fast as you could with ApiOpenStudio, because this is dedicated for this. So you've got the big advantage you basically got is you've got much quicker dev time, you've got much more sanitized storage in a single place, which you can then migrate to multiple repositories if you want. You've got granular access for all the individual users already out of the box. You don't need to worry about that. You've also got automated documentation. That's a massive saver, because from a DevX point of view, which is becoming very, very key now, the industry is starting to realize how important developer UX is. because developers are very important to the business when it comes to figuring out what the best product is to use. They are the ones that IT companies need to address in order to sell their products, like ApiOpenStudio, which is why we're working really hard on the next version for drag and drop interface to improve the UX even further. So yes, I hope that answers your questions there for Australia. Okay, so, and that's a good note. Thank you about future webcasts. I'll take that into account next time. There's probably not much I can do about that. That's more YouTube. However, it's duly noted. I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much for attending. And I hope to see you the next one, where I'll start going more into detail about ApiOpenStudio itself and the business opportunities that it'll offer. Thank you.